Hello and welcome to Dice and Demons. I'm Emma and today I'm going to show you how I painted Troglodon for my Lollipop Lizards, which is my Seraphon army for Age of Sigmar. And I start off, as you can see, with a model that's been primed using a white primer, and this one is White Scars from Citadel. And then I paint all over the skin with a contrast paint called Athematic Blue, which is a sort of nice, bright turquoise color. Painting with this color directly over white means, of course, that you're going to get a very light skin tone. Which is fine, but I think if this had been a sort of standalone project, I probably would have done something along the lines more of a slap chop thing, where I started off with perhaps a gray skin tone, then I had dry brushed it white, and then painted with the Athematic Blue on top just to get more definition for both shadows and highlights. But this is the way all the big dinos are painted for my Seraphon army, and I don't want this to stand out among the rest of them, so I'm just gonna go with this, even though I think it might look just a tiny bit better if the skin tone was a bit darker. Then after that I just dry brush it white, just again to help give a little bit of definition. This is a gaming piece, it's for an entire army, and so I'm not gonna spend ages trying to get like really smooth transitions or really smooth highlights. You could definitely spend more time on this than I'm doing here, but I think for a gaming piece this is just fine, and the skin is not what I want to draw attention to anyways with this color scheme. So I'm trying to go with something that is just nice and quick but will still look just fine on the tabletop. Then for the scales, I've decided to go with a rainbow theme. As you can probably tell from the name of my army, the Lollipop Lizards, all of them are painted in really, really bright colors, and I thought a toxic, venomous rainbow Troglodon would just fit right in. So yeah, rainbow it is. So I start off with a contrast paint called Blood Angels Red, which is, as you can see, a red color. And I use that on the bottom of the scales, just to get something that is that both makes sense sort of when you are looking at a rainbow, but also to make sure that it contrasts really nicely with the skin, so you don't mix in the two. So then I grab another contrast paint, and this one is called Gryph-hound Orange, and it's just something where I do a really quick wet blend, as you can see here. Again, not trying to go for the smoothest transitions. And for that, I think contrast paints and wet blending works really well. It's very, very quick and quite efficient as well. And you can always touch it up later on as you go. The yellow color I'm using here is also a contrast paint, and it's called Yanden Yellow. And again, I'm just trying to do a quick wet blend. Then for the green color, I'm using Warp Lightning. And I decided that because the surface is so big, I had to sort of split it in two. I couldn't keep on doing a complete wet blend and across the entire surface that I had to cover. So I took it in small bits, and of course that makes the blending not quite as smooth as you might like, but I think it works well enough for this. I'm going to be covering the scales with texture and both shadows and highlights later on, so I don't need a perfect surface to work from, just something that it's more like a roadmap really at this point, something that gives me an idea of where I want to paint the colors as I go on. The last row of these scales I'm gonna paint a turquoise color, and there are also darker turquoise colors than the Athematic Blue that I used for the skin, but I want something that is for sure a mixture of blue and green, like the contrast paints I'm using. So I'm simply doing another wet blend where I blend in a blue color called Salazar Blue with the green color I have already used on the scales underneath it. I've decided that the spikes that you can see go up from the back are gonna be painted in a bone color, both because I think it makes sense that they're a little bit different than the rest, but also to add a little bit of contrast to the overall color scheme and a little bit of visual interest as well. Then for this part here on the back, I'm not sure, would you call it a fin or what? I'm not quite sure what the correct English term for this is, but I'm gonna go with fin because I think it doesn't seem like it scales, but looks a little bit more like a fin you would find on a fish or something. Anyways, I am again using the Salazar Blue, and then I am blending that with Volupus Pink, which is also a contrast paint. With all the base colors being done, I can move on to working on the details. And I grabbed some Achillean green, which is also a contrast paint. It's a darker turquoise color. And I use that to add a little bit more definition to some of the shadows on the skin. Again, I'm doing this fairly quickly because this is not something I want to spend ages doing. The skin is not what's important on this model, but I still thought it was just too pale for my liking, and it lacked a little bit of definition, so I added some with the Achillean green. And as a last touch-up for the skin, I just used a bit of white paint. This is matte white from the Army Painter, and I used that to make sure I had some nice highlights exactly where I wanted them on the skin as well. This was again done relatively quickly. As you can see, I'm not going for really smooth blends or highlights or anything. You could definitely do this much better with glazing, but this is for a gaming piece, and I think this is completely adequate. Next up, I start working on the scales, which is the part of the project that I have been looking forward to the most. And I again grabbed the Achillean green, the darker turquoise color, and I used that to paint between each and every single scale on the back of the model. And I think this could probably be achieved much faster if you had something like a dark enamel wash. But I don't. I only have fluorescent enamel washes, and I don't think they would give me exactly what I'm going for here. And I also use the Achillean green to make sure I have some really nice sharp contrasts between the sort of fin and the bony protrusions on the back. And now it's time to start highlighting all the scales. So first off, I start working on the red scales, and the first color I'm using is Mephiston Red mixed in with just a tiny touch of orange paint, because the Mephiston Red on its own was just a little bit too dark to be actually visible on the scales, so that really didn't make a lot of sense. And I paint them sort of just like with an edge highlight all of the way around the scales, so I want them to be nice and sharp and stand out and really pop. And then for highlighting, I am using a fluorescent paint from Huge Miniatures, and this one is called Radar Red. I only use the fluorescent colors on the sides and top of each scale, so that there's a little bit of, a very slight illusion of light and shadow, but I still think it helps add just a little bit to the overall look of the model. Then for the orange parts of the model, I am using a color from Vallejo called Orange Fire, and I'm using that in the exact same way as I used the Mephiston Red. This is just mixed in with just a touch of yellow, just because again this color was just a little bit too dark on its own to really show up. The second highlight I am painting with another fluorescent color from Huge Miniatures, and this one is called Laser Orange. And it's a little bit more bright than what you can really see here, but it's exactly the same method. A sort of nice, relatively precise, I try to be a little bit neat here, edge highlight all around the scales. As you can probably tell, some of the scales are not that sharply defined, but I've decided to paint them up as though they are anyway, just because I think it makes more sense for the overall color scheme to paint it like that. For highlighting the yellow, first I'm using Flash Sketch Yellow from Citadel, which is just a nice sort of basic yellow tone. It's just, if you're thinking of the color yellow, this is more or less what you're thinking of. It's just yellow. The second highlight is achieved with another fluorescent paint. This one is called Starfire Yellow, and it's a bit of a colder yellow tone than I would perhaps ideally have liked. I like to highlight my yellows with warmer tones just because I think it works really well. But I wanted to make sure that all the scales had their final highlights done with a fluorescent paint, and I don't think you can get a warm fluorescent yellow tone. I think the only ones I've seen there, all of them a little bit cold and a little bit have a slight greenish tint to them. But yeah, I was willing to go that way here because I really wanted them all to be fluorescent. For the first layer of highlight on the green, I'm using Mood Green from Citadel. And it's worth noting that more or less all of the paints I'm using for this part of the project are used straight out of the pot, which I know is usually discouraged because using paints that are too thick rarely give you great results. It'll often lead to models that look a little bit chunky and uneven. But for something like this, I use the thicker paints for two reasons. One is that it's a bit easier to control. I don't run the risk of runny paints running into all the cracks between the individual scales, and also because I'm, a little bit lazy, so a thicker paint will give me a one coat edge highlight instead of having to go back over the same thing 2 or 3 times. So again, if I was going to paint something for a high-end painting competition, I would probably go with thinner paints, but for a gaming piece, it is completely fine. The final highlight for the green, I am painting using another fluorescent color, and this one is called Quantum Green. For the next row of scales, I am using a color from Vallejo called Aquamarine, which is a nice turquoise color. And you'll perhaps notice that I am not painting the lowest part of the scale like I have done with all the other scales here on the back. And that's because I want to sort of stress that the shape and the direction of the scales is changing. They're pointing more up. And so I only paint highlights that underline that direction, if that makes sense. And then for the last layer of highlights, I am mixing Blaster Blue from Huge Miniatures with the Quantum Green I used on the green scales. I wasn't quite happy with this last layer of highlights just because I thought it didn't pop as much as I wanted it to. And so I was really tempted to go back with a third highlight mixed with a little bit of white or something. But in the end, I decided against it because we have the bones sticking out on the back. And I wanted to make sure that you wouldn't get the very saturated colors of the scales mixed up with the bones. And so I decided to stay clear of the white and just hope that the turquoise would look a little bit better when contrasted with a brighter bone color behind it. Then for the fin, I started painting in with a blue color, and this one is Magic Blue from Vallejo, and I mixed that up with just a little bit of white again because it was slightly too dark to really stand out. Then for the final blue highlight, I used Blaster Blue from Huge Miniatures, and that is also mixed with a bit of white because on its own it's just a little bit too dark to really look like a decent highlight here. For the pink part of the model, I use a color from Vallejo called Warlord Purple, and this is the only part of the painting project where I will slightly attempt to get a nice smooth transition between the colors, because these are not scales like individual scales where it makes sense that there are sharp definitions between the colors. So to get a nice transition, I use a purple color here, a nice fluorescent purple color called Ultraviolet from Huge Miniatures, just to make a sort of smooth transition between the two colors. Next up, I grab another fluorescent paint, and this one is called Pulse Wave Pink. And I think it's just one of my favorite paints. It's just a really nice, very saturated fluorescent pink color. And if I have a chance to include it in my painting projects, I probably will. And lastly, I touch the tip of the fins with a fluorescent paint called Cyber Pink, which is more or less just a lighter version of the Pulse Wave Pink. And again, I'm really tempted to just mix in a tiny bit of white for a last highlight so that it'll really stand out and really pop. But again, I decided against it because of the bone colors I'll be adding next. And for highlighting the bone colors, I just grabbed a bit of a Wraith Bone from Citadel. It's basically just a nice beige paint. And I quickly highlighted the bones here. And I'm not going to spend ages doing really nice smooth transitions. I'm more or less just doing edge highlighting here because I don't mind that it looks a little bit stylized, and I don't want to spend ages on it either, to be honest. And last but certainly not least, or well, actually I think it's least, it's just a slight touch of white. I added some white to the bones, and I think it was a good decision not to add white to either the turquoise scales or the pink part of the fin, because I think it helps to create a little bit of contrast and more visual interest, where you have the very saturated look of the scales and the fin, and then the much more desaturated look of the bones, and also partly of the skin as well. And here you can see the finished model. I'm pretty happy with it. I think it looks fun, it looks bright, it looks colorful, and for sure it's gonna blend in just fine with the rest of the Lollipop Lizards. I can't wait to actually have a Troglodon on the tabletop again. I don't think I've had one for like 4 or 5 years, so it's been a long time, and I think it's a really fun model. If you know the Troglodon model, perhaps you'll notice that I have left out the sort of spittle effect that comes out of its mouth. And that's simply because it's a very long, very thin piece of plastic that I know I will snap in about 2 seconds, either transporting it or just being clumsy on the tabletop. And so I have just decided to just not include it in the model. So while I'm fairly happy with this model and I can't wait to put it on the tabletop, I think perhaps it would have looked a little bit better, as I said, with a bit of a darker skin tone perhaps. And I also think that creating more smooth transitions between the colors on the scales, so that for instance you would add a little bit of orange to the red scales adjacent to orange and so on, that could also make it look a little bit better. But this was a sort of a painting project where I wanted it to look good and I wanted it to be fun, but I also wanted to be fairly efficient with it. So this is a compromise, and I think it's everything that I had imagined it was going to be, with the amount of time and effort I was willing to put into it. And since I used the fluorescent colors, of course, this glows under UV light, which is, as I usually say, fairly useless, but very, very fun. And so even though I'm not ever gonna be playing this under UV light, I'm really happy that I decided to sort of compromise my idea of a nice warm yellow highlight for the fluorescent one, because this is just fun. I don't know, it's really silly and it's completely unnecessary, and you probably should not, be making compromises with the overall color scheme just because you want a fun effect that no one is ever gonna see in real life. But it's my dino toy, and I think it's worth it. So that was what I wanted to show you today, guys. But before you leave, I would, as always, like to take the opportunity to thank the wonderful people who support Dice and Demons over on Patreon. So thank you so much to Thomas Madsen, Gwenael, Jordan Hollands, Queen's Wolf, Double J's Terrain, Mola, Steve Eberly, Nassim Makaya, Andrew Correa, Anthony Polcastro, Bosworth the Rogue, Mando Project, Starcon85, S. Beer, Echinocicus, Elliot Philby, Cyberfossil, Cinnamon Coffee 87, Terrainery, Joshua and Anya Pavelsic, Charlie Robertson, and VT Knight 007. If you would also like to support my channel over on Patreon, I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. Also remember that you can stay up to date on my painting projects over on X, formerly known as Twitter, and on Instagram, where you can also find me as Dice and Demons. So if you have any sort of suggestions for future videos, if you have comments, questions, any sort of thing, leave that in the comments section and I'll do my very best to get back to you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!